As recorded. Right. Hello, this is my test on the key points of chapters 10 and 11 for the textbook. And yeah, so I'm just gonna start. So the chapters 10 and 11 cover the years between the early 1970s and the late 1990s. And I think even they mentioned the early 2000s, but yeah, this is a very, I mean, it's a very violent time for Latin America. There's finally established borders, finally established countries, but internally, these countries are they're very violent against the people. There was a lot of military control in these countries, which was usually backed by the US government. And the reason for that is because the military protected the elites, and the elites traded with the United States. And that was good for the United States and the elites because it promoted like fantastic economic growth for the countries. However, it left a lot of people, it only benefited the elite, basically. It only benefited the elite in the United States and the military. So a lot of people were left without jobs, without homes, without even basic needs like food and water and electricity, which was a lot of women and children and poor farmers in these countries that were didn't have the power to fight back against people with guns, but were just suffering. And yeah, so there was a lot of, like I said before, a lot of military control, and there was some attempts for reform in Latin America during this time. A lot of that was through the Catholic Church, who tried to bring more awareness to the violence in Latin America, and they even provided safe spaces for protesters to go and organize. But unfortunately, those churches were targeted very violently by the Latin American government militaries. So it was, yeah, it was a very sad time. And it was very, like, unfortunately, there was a lot of violence in the history of Latin America. So just continued that violence. Um, in the late 18 or sorry, in the late 1980s, they did attempt to bring democracy back to Latin America by having elections. However, the United States the United States saw that they were having elections again and just assumed that they were following like true democracy. However, the elections were usually rigged or fake or just symbolic or just to keep the US off of their back. So the elections unfortunately led nowhere. And anybody who was elected into a role of power was typically not there to benefit the poor people of Latin America. Um, there was even attempted military trials in the late 1980s, but those were also not really real trials because um, most of the sorry, what is it called? Most of the officers that were leaders of the military groups were just pardoned anyway. So, yeah, that was chapter 10's notes. So continue on to chapter 11, which covered the 1980s through the 1990s into the 2000s. This was kind of, oh, I didn't even touch on the oil crisis in the 1970s, but um, sorry. Okay. Um, the Cold War stopped, which was good and bad. Good for the United States because they didn't have nuclear weapons next to them anymore. Bad for Cuba because the USSR left Cuba, which left Cuba with nothing. And the one man who rose to power was Fidel Castro, and he was also not very good for Cuba. But so Cuba suffered extremely after the Cold War. And they even kicked the United States out, and the United States currently only has Guantanamo Bay, which occupies Cuba, and that's kind of the only US occupation in Cuba at the moment. But yeah, they also tried, there was an increased use of neoliberalism. Wow, butchered that, I'm sorry. Increased use of neoliberalism, which promoted economic growth, which economic growth just means benefiting the elite, and then um, zero structure, and then limited government control. So basically, the elites were just allowed to do whatever they wanted still, and the government was not allowed to intervene with the people that much, which caused many, many people to start protesting again and more civil wars. But um, eventually, those civil wars did just die out on their own. People get tired, and then um, the most prominent country mentioned, which had its own section, was Colombia, which was considered one of the most violent countries in South America for a long time. They were suffering from large military presence and political unrest since the 1960s, which included guerrilla warfare. And the US tried to help, but the US was always usually on the side of the military, which was killing the people. And yeah, and the violence finally ended by the late 1990s. The last country to be in political unrest, like violent political unrest, was Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, but it was eventually also subsided. So yeah, the 1970s to the 1990s were very, very violent and very dark for Latin America, but and it had a large US and other foreign country control with its economy and its political decisions in those countries. So there is a continued lack of internal control and internal structure and just basically increased foreign influence, which has not been good for the 80% of the population in Latin America. So, yeah.